Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We will begin momentarily as more people trickle in. Well, good morning, good afternoon again. Today's webinar will be delivered by our colleagues from CIBC and IDP. The title is Welcoming Wisely the Economic Impact of International Education. This webinar will explore the intersection of international education and the economic future in Canada. Before we begin, I would like to start with a mention of a few housekeeping notes. Please take a moment to locate the Zoom options at the bottom of your screen. Locate the chat and expand it onto your screen so you can see the messages that we will be sharing during the webinar. As shown in the chat, this webinar is being recorded. The link to the recording will be shared via email within the next day or so. Should you be experiencing any technical issues or want to send private message via the chat, and I will assist you momentarily. However, if you have any questions for our panelists, please send them via the Q&A so everyone can see your questions as well as the answer provided by the panelists. You can also locate the reactions from the control panel in case you want to share a thumbs up during the session or raise your hand. It is now with great pleasure that I introduce Miriam Moshiri, Executive Director and Head Global Payment Services for Alternate Solutions Group at CIBC. Miriam, I pass it on to you.
Thank you for that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm speaking from is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Wendat peoples. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many of the Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful for the opportunity to work in this community. I'll welcome all of you to please share your own land acknowledgements in the chat from where you are joining us today. In my role, I have the privilege of working with education institutions and businesses around the world, helping them navigate the evolving landscape of payments and supporting their strategic objectives. On behalf of CIBC, IDP, and CBIE, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to each of you for being here today. Your participation is invaluable as we come together to discuss important topics impacting our sector. Here's an overview of today's session. We'll begin with opening remarks from Ali Jaffrey, our Senior Economist and Executive Director at CIBC. This will be followed by a panel discussion featuring our esteemed senior leaders across the industry, moderated by Christine Walk, who is a Senior VP, Partnerships and Stakeholder Engagement, North America, IDP. So to begin, it's my pleasure to introduce Ali Jaffrey. Ali brings a wealth of expertise to our discussion today. He will present a macroeconomic overview, examining how student immigration influences not only labor markets, productivity trends, but also supply chain challenges such as housing. Prior to his role at CIBC, Ali held senior positions at the Bank of Canada, Finance Canada, and QNB. Ali, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Miriam, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm just going to get my slides up on the screen. Can you see?
Yeah, that's perfect, Ali.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, all right, let's do it. This has been a lot of fun preparing for this. And you know what? And usually when I start to prepare for a subject, the first thing I do is see how good is the meme game. And the meme game on this subject is very good, as you can see on the screen. We all know why we're here. The overcorrection in student permits has captured a lot of attention around universities and colleges, and also in the economy writ large. And we've seen a significant retrenchment this year, about 2/3 below kind of a pre-pandemic trend. Shout out to all my friends in our IRCC if they're in the audience. Some really good memes, English and Urdu out there. But let's take a step back here and try to think about how and why we got here. And I think a good place to begin there is looking at the history of Canadian immigration over the past 2.5 decades. And I've divided this up into kind of 3 separate regimes. The first is what we saw in 2000 to 2015, where we had fairly stable population growth around 1%, which amounted to around 200, a little over 200,000 people come into Canada every year, and those were mostly permanent residents. So, individuals or families with a long-term stake in their economic and social future in Canada. And then in 2015, 2016, we had a Liberal majority government take power, and they changed the immigration regime and they began to increase immigration. You can see that here. Not only the amount, so we almost doubled the average annual flows of immigrants, but also the type, that we went from predominantly, overwhelmingly, I should say, permanent residents, to an increasing mix of non-permanent residents, which would be students and temporary workers. And there was a change in the permitting regime, which I won't speak to a lot today. I'm sure our panelists will have a lot to say about, but that was an important feature of this new regime. And then the pandemic happened. And there were different ideas about where the future of the economy was going, what the demands of the labor market were, and where labor shortages would be in the future. And so there was this explosion in immigration. Some of it anticipated, a lot of it not anticipated. And most of this was students or students who transitioned to work permits. There's a patchwork of that, and I won't speak to that in detail, but in our assessment over the years, that it was clear that the government wasn't fully aware of of how many people were coming and how easily they were transitioning, and so there was a significant amount of overstaying. But the bottom line is we've seen now, immigration increased by almost 4 times relative to this previous regime that were in the kind of the stable population growth, and more than double what it was over the pre-pandemic. And the economy has not been able to adjust to this transition from that stable to this doubling, and now 4 times. And it's shown, we've seen in the data, strains in a number of areas. Obviously in housing, on the chart on the left here, this is population growth and rental inflation in Canada, and it's more acute in certain areas, but we've seen that across the data for many years, and now we see rental inflation start to cool as population growth has ebbed. But also the labor market has not been able to absorb the new entrants. So on the right, I've shown the increase in the unemployment rate since the beginning of 2023. And so we've had a substantial rise in joblessness in Canada over that period, around a 7% unemployment rate. So about 2 percentage points increase. And newer immigrants, many of whom would fall in that student or former student bucket, have actually contributed disproportionately relative to their share of the population. They account for about 15 to 20% of the increase in unemployment, despite being 7% of the population. So, they're not the bulk of the increase in joblessness. There's a variety of shocks in the economy, but it's been a struggle for newcomers in the economy. Now, so the bottom line is, obviously the economy hasn't kept pace with the increase in population, and this is one of the key metrics that policymakers, like my former colleagues at the Bank of Canada, and also probably in the PMO, would be looking at to assess, how effective has this regime been, and how do we calibrate immigration policy considering our economic needs? And they're going to look, squarely at GDP per capita. It's also a measure of living standards across, a major macro indicator of living standards. And so I've calculated that over those different regimes that I mentioned. So the red bars here show GDP per capita from 2000 to 2015 across a range of advanced economies, and then since 2016 to 2024, as we've increased population growth in the country, and you can see that Canada's per capita GDP growth went from kind of upper middle amongst G7 and advanced economies to the worst, and that's obviously created significant worries about, the economic future of Canada. And that's ultimately part of the main reason why it's prompted this major U-turn. And I think, there's merit to that view, that we certainly want to increase GDP per capita, but it's a complicated story. And just pointing the finger at immigration, I think, is too reductive, because a lot of things have happened over this period. Even the initial liberal majority government that took power, that began to change the immigration regime, they had a focus on climate, and that was broadly supported at the time, but it had negative effects on investment in many natural resources parts of our economy. Then, of course, the pandemic, had a substantial impact on growth globally, and its aftermath, in particular, really had a negative impact on investment and productivity in Canada. We have major supply shocks, the disruption of supply chains happening, inflation surging, and of course the Bank of Canada having to raise rates at orders of magnitude that we haven't seen in several decades. All of that depressed the investment environment substantially, both housing and for businesses. And also at the same time, local governments really didn't act to try to alleviate some of the housing shortages, which have a strong regulatory component in nature. And so, it's kind of a complicated situation that certainly there was too much immigration, and that pushed up against, some of the strains in the economy, or created strains in the economy. But at the same time, that influx of students actually provided a lifeline for growth, given all these other shocks that happened. So what I have on the screen is an estimate of potential GDP. And that's a metric that the Bank of Canada uses to assess what's the long run trend rate of growth in the economy. And before the pandemic, they estimated around 2%. And even over this post-pandemic period, it was still around 2%. But the main driver of that long run growth was actually population, from the spending and the demand generated by students. But what flipped was labor productivity, which is that mix of capital and labor, that investment component, and the use of new technologies. That it went from being, around a little under a percentage point to our long run rate of growth to a negative contribution. So a 1 percentage point swing. And some people might contend that the increase in population had something to do with that, but when you look at the details of that, it really doesn't. A lot of that has to do with declines in investment in natural resources and manufacturing, which are structural in nature. And actually, if we didn't have the surge in population, we likely would have had a recession over that post-pandemic period in Canada. So it's not by any means the best macroeconomic policy I would advocate for, but we can't point the finger squarely at that either. And when we look toward the future, this is looking at the evolution of job vacancies in Canada. And predominantly the demand remains for high-skilled labor, particularly in healthcare, but also in areas of finance, public service, professional scientific services. Our businesses are still looking for this type of labor, and that's where we're going to get from our students and foreign students. And I think we've done a good job of increasing the share of students in STEM disciplines. That's what you see on the screen, the evolution of where students are studying over the past decade. But we haven't done as well in health and engineering. It's only modestly increased over the past decade, so there's some work to be done there. And this surge in business students doesn't really fully align with some of the new priorities. So I think there's still work to be done, but I view this generally as we've made progress in that. And it's a clear indication that we need to still be bringing the best and the brightest to Canada. Now, the government's growth strategy is all about build, baby, build. I actually think, that we should also be thinking about, as I like to say, services, Habibi, services. That, it's good to have investment in natural resources and infrastructure. That's going to lift growth. But when we really look at the Canadian economy, 70, 80% of it is based in services. That's stuff what you guys do, what governments do, what banks do, IT companies, what recreation entertainment industries do. And many experts in global trade argue that the future of global trade is not in goods, the stuff that we make, or extract from the earth, but in those services that we provide, these intermediate financial services, IT services related to generative AI. And actually, when we look at the data, Canada has done very well in service exports, of which obviously international education is a big part of that. And I think we should be equally as focused on this as we are on, some of the big nation building projects that the government is advancing. And it's a particularly opportune time, given the gentleman on the screen is lighting fire to this part of the economy in the US and deterring talent from entering the US, both in terms of the normal immigration stream and students. So I think that there's a significant bang for the buck that we can generate by putting more attention on this, and bringing in the highest quality foreign students should be a part of that growth strategy. Now, so what I've done here is try to forecast where I think student immigration is going to go. And clearly it's a discussion now about bringing in quality over quantity. It's very unlikely that the government is going to return to anything near what we saw in that post-pandemic period. And what we've done here is we've taken Statistics Canada's demographic projections of Canadian students and made assumptions around, if we return to a regime around 400,000 people per year by the end of the decade, which is roughly speaking around 1% population growth, again, kind of going back to a more stable population growth regime, and within foreign students amounting around 10 to 15% of that intake, it brings us around 2.5 million students by the end of the decade, with a foreign student contribution of that ranging from 40 to 60,000. So perhaps this is the new normal. My conversation with policymakers has kind of made me think this is probably a more reasonable base case to be had. That we're not going back, it's unlikely to return to a very rapid immigration period, but so universities and colleges are going to have to adapt. But also at the same time, provinces are going to have to think about how they fund this, because if we have fewer foreign students who contribute more in terms of tuition fees, there's going to have to be some thought about the fiscal balance that in terms of how provinces contribute to this challenge. So I began with a meme. I like to end with memes. Too much of change is not always a good thing, and we've learned that over the past few years. And that probably has a lot to do with immigration being very poorly managed by the federal government during that time. But we can't ignore the lifeline that is provided to the Canadian economy at this time. And we want an immigration system that's predictable and stable, and likely one that's going to be slower as well, around that 1% population growth range. I think that's sensible. And of course, universities and colleges have to adapt. They're already adapting. I know many of you are, but the federal government and policymakers need to provide clarity. It's not only, these U-turns don't only damage, the brand Canada, in terms of attracting talent, but our economic credibility as well. I've talked to international investors all the time, and they question, why Canada had to make these rapid adjustments. So that piece really needs to be a part of future policymaking, that we need something that prevents us from having to make these major U-turns again. But I think at the end of the day, foreign students are an important part of our growth plan. I estimate that they add about 0.2 to 0.4% of our long-run GDP growth, even if we return to a regime like I'm kind of describing. And it's important because they're going to offset increased population aging and reduce the mismatch in the job market. So I've spoken a lot. I really appreciate your time today, and I'm going to pass the mic back to Christine.
Thank you so much, Ali. Fascinating data and lots to unpack here with the panel. So I'm going to ask the panel to turn on their cameras now as well. And I was thinking we started planning this or talking about this webinar about 6 or 7 months ago. So we're just really thrilled that Ali, you took the time and the panelists took valuable time out of their busy schedules to share your expertise on this topic, which is incredibly timely and in what has been a very challenging time for our sector. So now, thank you. So now I'm going to take a moment and I'd like to introduce our panel. I'm going to start with you, Larissa. So Larissa Bezo is president. Did I lose some people? Oh no, there we are, just change of screen. Larissa Bezo is President and CEO of the Canadian Bureau for International Education, with over 25 years of experience in public service and international development. She's held senior roles with the Government of Saskatchewan, the World Bank, and CBIE, and is recognized globally as a leader. And of course, we know her very well here at home. So thank you, Larissa, for joining us today and for your strategic leadership and continued commitment to global education in Canada. Welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rupa Banerjee. Rupa is Canada Research Chair and Professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her research focuses on immigrant employment integration, workplace diversity, and ethno-racial discrimination. She also serves as the Associate Editor for the journal Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, contributing to global scholarship on equity and inclusion. Thank you so much for joining us. Craig Riggs. Craig is the editor of ISEF Monitor. Hi, Craig. Leading source market intelligence for international student recruitment. He also publishes ISEF Insights, which we all know and love, and co-hosts the ISEF podcast, offering expert global analysis on global education trends and policy shifts. Welcome, Craig, and thank you for taking the time. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Robert Summerby Murray. Robert is the former president and vice chancellor of St. Mary's University and a global champion of global education and inclusive leadership. He is currently the chair of the board for EduNova and former chair of the board for the Canadian Bureau of International Education, CBIE. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Robert. Okay, so let's jump into this. We're going to first start with, I think, labor force development. And Rupa, I'm going to hand it to you. So based on your extensive experience in research and as Canada Research Chair, what are the key labor force challenges in Canada that we're facing today? And, you know, we've talked about this, but if you want to do some reflecting, and I have other questions before you jump into it, but I'm going to pass it to you to just talk a bit about the presentation and what are the key labor force challenges Canada is facing today. Thank you, Rupa.
Yeah, thanks so much, Christine. I think Ali did an excellent job of setting up context for us. And I am going to kind of echo a lot of the things that he presented. But right now, Canada's labor market is experiencing this simultaneous headwind of abrupt changes in population growth, as we know, as non-permanent residents decline, as people's permits come to an end, most people leave, and that is resulting in a really rapid reduction in resident growth. At the same time, there was just this morning, I was reading a report from the Labor Market Information Council that showed a rapid contraction of entry-level vacancies for undergraduate programs. And this creates this situation where there's really a gap, a mismatch, where the available jobs for new grads is decreasing. On the other hand, we see retirements increasing, and we have this large population growth from the last few years that is now quickly reversing. So I think the one thing that Ali pointed out that's really important is this rapid change is very damaging. And so in terms of key labor force challenges, I mean, this creates this pipeline mismatch or risk. So with the folks that are still in the pipeline of international students and postgraduate work permit holders, we still see that there is, a lot of folks who are going to be graduating or have recently graduated who are facing massive challenges finding work in their field, finding work up to their skill level. And that mismatch of skills is very damaging in terms of our ability to actually leverage the talent that we're actually developing in our universities, but also of newcomers coming in from abroad. So we have all of these headwinds happening at the same time. At the same time, as we see folks leaving, there are sectors of the labor market that are desperately experiencing labor gaps and shortages. And it's this what I often call like qualitative labor gap that really, I think, is causing confusion and challenge. So when we say qualitative labor gap, what I mean is there's a lot of people. There's still, even with the decrease in non-permanent residents, there's a lot of people who are still experiencing unemployment, as we've seen the unemployment numbers quite high. But on the other hand, employers are also really struggling to find talent in many, many areas. So this gap between who is needed, where they're needed, and where they actually are is causing massive challenges. And this speaks directly to the lack of investment and the contribution of that lack of investment and innovation on Canada's productivity growth. So Canada's productivity growth is not just about how many people we bring in, it's about actually having robust opportunities for them to use their skills, to be able to actually contribute to the labor market. So, you know, the talent that we're bringing in and the talent that we're cultivating through our education system with international students is not translating into the output that it should. So that's one thing that I would say. And I'm not sure, Christine, if you wanted me to comment on some of the kind of what we can do about it question yet, or if you want me to wait on that.
I think that would be great. Maybe we'll get into that right now, Ruba, if we could. And I mean, so that leads us to that second question. So how do we better align workforce development with the needs of high demand sectors? And this reminds me, I was just quickly looking it up, of a report probably from 10 years ago that was called People Without Jobs, Jobs Without People, the Future of Ontario's Labor Market. I'm madly searching it. R. Minor, I think, was published this out of the University of Waterloo.
Mm-hmm.
Is this where we are right now? And it sounds like it. And so then, yeah, how can we make better alignment so we're not in this situation?
So I think that during that period of rapid accelerated growth in international student recruitment, a lot of programs were developed or expanded that really did not have the potential to provide jobs for people, essentially. And so, you know, I really point to those myriad of business programs in particular, where we see a lot of those business grads faced massive challenges finding work just because of the number of programs that were existing with very similar offerings, with really not much labor market connection. So what I would say is that we need to really take a strategic look at the kind of programs that are being offered in our colleges and universities. And the other thing that this new report that I was just reading this morning showed is that actually college grads have a higher placement rate at the moment than university grads overall. Now, of course, there's a lot of variation by which department, which faculty, which discipline you're talking about. But within the college sector, I think there's real room for some strategic thinking of what kind of programs should be offered and recruited and really promoted to international grads. With that, we know certain things work. We know that having work integrated learning is incredibly important, particularly for international students, because it is those actual connections with the workforce, the networks that develops, and the real life skills that provides that actually helps new grads in general, but international new grads in particular, make their way into the labor market. So not just offering programs that don't have any connection to jobs while they're learning. And then on top of that, I think having competency frameworks and recognition of prior learning within our immigration system more broadly, like just if we step away from the international student piece, is so important. We still have been talking about foreign credential recognition so many, 2 decades down the road after we started this conversation. It still hasn't really made too much progress there. So in terms of what we can do, I think we need to really look at what kind of programs should be expanded, what kind of programs should not be offered in our post-secondary sector that really do not have a high demand. And so we see, for example, in healthcare, in engineering, there's huge demand. And yet those are not the areas where we see international students coming to study. And so that's
Yeah.
a real problem.
Thank you. And I think the next problem that we're going to discuss too is how do we get people interested in coming back to Canada once we do that, since the brand's taken a bit of a beating. Okay, so Larissa, now I'd like to turn to you and talk a bit about the impact on education institutions and on our sector, our colleagues across the country. So how are colleges and universities adapting their program, to the first point, in response to these changing market demands? And what can educational institutions do, and who can they partner with to more effectively with our industry to enhance this workforce readiness for students and young grads or new grads at the undergraduate level and beyond?
Thanks, Christine. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the points that Rupa was making in your initial discussion, and certainly, jumping off of Ali's presentation. I think, there's a need for clarity in a number of areas if we're really going to try to calibrate and advance the kind of alignment that we're talking about. And for our institutions that, find themselves in the midst of this upheaval and kind of these policy U-turns that Ali talked about, it's a challenge in the sense that, they've really been forced to recalibrate in real time. We've all used the analogy of, the pilot sitting in the cockpit, and in the midst of flight, the rules are changing in terms of the controls, the conditions around the plane. Everything is happening in real time. So there's a tremendous amount of upheaval. What has that impact been? I think for those of us that are following this very closely day to day, I think Ken Steele at Eduvation is doing a great job in terms of really documenting this. And the sad reality is that we've seen a very significant number of closures, a significant number of staff layoffs, and a significant number of program suspensions, and that number keeps climbing, almost like the birth rate, calculator that we see online. We're seeing those adjustments happen in real time. So the impact is very significant, and as Ali talked about, even in this immediate year, given that new study permit approvals are down, over 70%, we all have a sense of, what that really means. I think for institutions, however, we find ourselves, they don't exist in a vacuum. They're anchors in communities right across this country. They exist within a community ecosystem. They operate within, different policy frameworks, municipal, provincial, and the likes. And so having to navigate that in an environment where it doesn't feel as though we kind of strategically have our house in order in terms of that talent strategy that Canada needs, and that, that directional vision, being able to then distill that into how we meet the needs of our local communities, how we advance, our global engagement through the attraction, the training, the graduation of both domestic and international talent. This really is the quandary. And I think we're going to continue to struggle with this until we get to a place where we have that clarity. We haven't provided that clarity to international talent who are looking for a learning abroad experience. So absent that clarity, we're not going to see students choose to come unless they see a viable pathway. And it doesn't mean that every student seeks to come and to stay in Canada, but for those who may be seeking that, they need clarity around what is possible. And it is a narrower subset of opportunities, but one would hope over the medium term that those are going to be more focused and potentially more meaningful because of that kind of alignment that we're working towards. Institutions are in a place where they are trying to meet community needs, and they do, a tremendous amount of work in terms of trying to align curriculum. And they have processes and annual cycles where they really work with industry and looking at particular sectors and leaning into those needs and trying to stay current, all the while navigating, everything from AI disruption to many other impacts in terms of preparing that future labor market. I think this is part of the challenge, but we're butting up against a policy framework where with the postgraduate work permit, we're still defining needs nationally. That really doesn't meet the needs of our communities. And I can't tell you the countless conversations that I'm having with institutional leaders who are saying, we're engaging with provincial governments, we're engaging with municipal leaders. We know what the needs are of our communities, but they're not aligned with how Canada has said, these are our pressing labor market needs. Yes, we want to see mobility and choice, in terms of an open work permit, such as the postgraduate work permit, but there needs to be a lot more work done to align that. And I think from our perspective, absent a strategy that allows us to find that balance, and recognize as well that, you know, we need highly skilled talent, but we need them in a number of sectors, and what that looks like is very different. You know, CBIE's own surveying tells us that 1/3 of international students are very keen to engage in entrepreneurial activity. We know from the data, for example, international talent is 50 to 60%, entrepreneurial in a postgraduate environment. How are we considering that, vis-a-vis explicit links between, a sector high in demand, and then how we're creating those spaces and opportunities. And, I would be remiss not to also say, I think as we're trying to advance Canada's global engagement, we also have to remember there's a soft power play here for Canada, where we also need to make sure that we're not solely focused on that alignment, but we're also graduating, future ambassadors who are going to help plant that flag and maintain and nurture those relationships when they either return to their home countries or perhaps move on to other countries and regions. And so finding that balance, from my perspective, requires us to bring those key stakeholders, post-secondary, business, government, together to really talk about how we calibrate this. And that's the piece that's missing from our perspective.
Thank you, Larissa. And does it seem a far ways away? I mean,
I think those conversations are accelerating. I mean, this webinar, I think, is one example. We're certainly seeing that as industry is waking up, quite profoundly to the impacts that we're seeing day to day on the ground. But there's work to be done, and I think we need a more structured way to engage around this to really get it right. But I think we will get there. It's going to be messy, but I'm hopeful that we will get there.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Larissa. Yeah, and it seems messy right now, doesn't it? Okay, Robert, let's talk a bit about the regional economic impact. And I mean, from your perspective as the former president of St. Mary's University and chair of the board of EduNova, how is the regional Atlantic economy being affected by shifting labor market demographics and skills gaps? If you want to speak more broadly about the rest of the country, we would welcome that as well.
Well, thanks, Christine, and thanks to the other panelists for some insightful comments as we work our way through what is a challenging topic for Canada as a whole, but also for Canada's regions. Certainly, if we look at the last 2 years, the changes in federal policy in relation to international education has had a profound impact on this region from where I speak today. When I chaired the Association of Atlantic Universities, we commissioned a consultant's report. That consultant determined that the income loss in Atlantic Canada between 2023 and 2024, I don't have the 2025 data, but was $163 million loss in direct outputs, $165 million loss in provincial GDP across the 4 Atlantic provinces, $94 million in income, and that is primarily at the provincial and federal level tax level. So imagine sitting around your cabinet table as a provincial government or federally and say, "Hi, Minister, I just lost you $17 million in tax revenues." That's the sort of scale we saw at the individual provincial level and at the federal level as well. And just over 2,200 full-time equivalent jobs lost. That was the result of our region having about 30% international students across our organizations, our colleges, our universities, and losing somewhere in the order of 2,500 to 2,700 students below what the prediction was. So the impact on our regional economies has been significant. There are direct impacts on institutions of the sort that Larissa has spoken of. And yes, that includes layoffs, program closures, those sorts of things that have a major impact on communities. But the change in the skills in community and the sorts of things that Ali and Rupa were speaking to as well have been profound. So if you think of the pipeline of high quality graduates from our universities, and let's say those that are coming into the banking industry, they're graduating with skills in finance or business data analytics or AI, they are not finding those jobs in the banking industry. The banking industry itself is struggling to find that high quality talent pool as they go. And it's taken a while for business to recognize that this pipeline has been shut off. Now, I expect that those pipelines are going to be stronger in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. But in regional economies, the regions of Canada, which are already facing challenges of demographics. I'm in a province that has 1 million people and had a climbing population growth for 2 years of the pandemic and beyond, and is now plummeting down the other side. There is a profound impact on what we've seen as a result of federal policy and, bluntly, the result of provincial government policies not responding quickly enough to the labour market challenges, the higher ed challenges, and the policy opportunities that are in front of us.
Mm-hmm. And I think it comes back to like how I'm always back to how are we going to continue to solve, how are we going to continue to attract, to address these regional needs at this micro level after this damage has been done? Like, how do we come together right now? It seems almost, it doesn't seem insurmountable, but it's like we need to roll up our sleeves and work together, as Larissa said, as business, as community, as employers, as educational institutions. Is there any movement towards this in Atlantic Canada?
Absolutely. And so I was very pleased to put my Egenova board hat on for a moment and speak to the work that this organization does. It's an organization that has a focus on, first of all, international recruitment, high quality recruitment globally to bring international students to Nova Scotia. But it also has a series of programs that are loosely, I would categorize them as work integrated learning and community engagement programs. So each year our Study and Stay Connect program runs about 100 odd students through a program where they are connected into businesses. They have individualized mentors who are providing their pathways, acculturation to community, acculturation to business practice or the practice of the industry into which they're headed, and they get that labor force attachment. Now, if we could scale that up, which is what we're hoping to do, to build out what we're calling the Atlantic Education Destination Model, to be a partner with the Atlantic Immigration Program with the Government of Canada. We have an opportunity there to bring, and we are bringing, our 4 provincial governments to that table and working with IRCC and others to build that broader strategy, which will help not only arrest population decline, but build on the successes of those other programs. Vitally important.
That sounds incredible, and perhaps a good framework for other communities across the country to look at. So now I'm going to turn to Craig, and then we're going to come back and get going with everybody. But Craig, Canada's global competitiveness. We'd love to hear, considering your position as editor-in-chief of ISEF Monitor, and looking at the changes in the geopolitical landscapes, how is Canada's perceived lack of openness impacting its ability to attract global talent? As Ali has written, seems like we threw out the baby with the bathwater here.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I mean, I think the answer to your question in terms of how has our ability to attract talent been impacted, the answer is pretty severely. I mean, none of the numbers are good this year. We've heard some reference to them during the conversation already, but I mean, it's possible to become, I think, a little bit numb to that when we bandy these numbers around. But I mean, it's pretty severe. The overall study permit applications application volumes are down roughly 50% in the first half of this year compared to the same period last year. I think quite significantly, approval rates for new study permit applications have fallen a great deal over that same period. The first half of this year, the overall study permit approval rate is 30%. Like, that is historically low, right? Just think about that for a minute. You know, the application volumes are being hollowed out and the approval rates are crashing as well, right? Last year, at the same time, the approval rate was just over 51%, right? So that's there's a couple of very large numbers to start us off with, right? There was a lot of concern last year about the enrollment cap, of course, when it was introduced. I don't think we have to worry about it. We're not going to get anywhere near the enrollment cap this year. That is not a problem. That's not the problem we have. The problem we have is that the number of new study permits issued through, again, the first half of this year is trending well below those cap limits, right? And so those, you know, what those numbers tell you is that we have had such a number of policy settings introduced over the last year or so that students don't know what to expect of Canada. The Canadian government spent most of last year sending very strong signals to the marketplace that there is a more restrictive environment for international students in the country. And what those numbers that I've just rattled off are telling us is that that message has been received loud and clear. I spent a lot of time talking to agents and to other stakeholders that have a lot of insights into student sentiment and on student attitudes towards study in Canada or study abroad generally. I can say, I think, that the demand for study in Canada remains strong, but the international student marketplace is not a market that tolerates uncertainty or confusion very well. The stakes are too high at the level of the individual student in the decision that they make about where and what to study. The stakes are too high, and Canada has introduced plenty of confusion and uncertainty over the last year or so.
Yeah, Craig, agreed. And our student surveys, Emerging Futures 8 is about to come out. We were #1 throughout the pandemic in terms of student perceptions against all the big four, let's say, English-speaking destinations. And now I believe we're #4. Craig, can you talk a bit about how our policy compares to the big competitors that we have, like Australia, UK, and then also what you expect from the US? Like, we hear in the news, we see that there's rising numbers of interest in both American students and maybe just American students, but also other students turning to Canada. Are we positioned well to take this opportunity?
Yeah, well, no, we're not positioned well to take advantage of any disruption in the US, frankly. But in terms of how our policies compare to other major study destinations, I mean, colloquially, we speak about the big four, which is the US, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada, right? That have had historically have had the lion's share of internationally mobile students. All of those big four countries have been significantly disrupted over the last year or so. The destination that is most similar to Canada in its policy approach has been Australia. In Australia, there is also an enrollment cap. There's a host of related policy changes around international students. Student numbers are down there as a result. English language training and vocational training sectors have been especially impacted. The disruption has been, to this point, relatively mild in the UK. The main policy direction there has been to limit the extent to which dependent family members can accompany students into the country. That's certainly had an impact on a couple of key sending markets, but overall, their numbers have been resilient and rising this year. There's more change on the horizon in the UK this year, especially with increased compliance requirements for universities and a new government levy on international student fees that's expected to be coming along shortly. And I think the US, to put it plainly, has just been fairly chaotic, right? With a lot of disruption in student flows this year. There's been more confusion and uncertainty in that sense around some of the actions of the US administration than any clear policy direction. But I think the fundamental thing that all four countries have in common is that we find in each a rising tide of public concern around immigration, or even a rise in anti-immigration sentiment. I was in London a few weeks ago, and I accidentally walked right into the middle of a massive anti-immigration protest there that was attended reportedly by like 100,000 people, right? It's not just a fringe issue. Needless to say, that has a big impact on the political climate in each country, and that's led us to where we are today, I would say.
Yeah. I think too, in talking about this webinar, one of our audiences we want to reach is the Canadian public. I'm not sure that we're doing it today. It's probably mostly our industry, but I think that there's an education like this discussion that we have an audience here at home that we have to convince, because as long as there's an anti-immigration sentiment, the government may continue with the confusion, mixed messages, etc. And Canada will continue to be seen as a less than welcoming place. This is was not on the briefing notes, but does anyone have anything? Maybe I'll open this up to everybody. How do we, I think we do sessions like this. We can write articles. We'll be writing an article, post this. We can get into the media and etc. But how do we reach the Canadian public to educate on the nuances that Ali talked about of the economy? So it's just not that here's the bad actors, here's the etc. Robert.
I think that's a really important question to ask, and I applaud the idea of more publicity that speaks to the rationale behind high quality immigration, high quality talent to our country. And we have tended, I know Ali went back a couple of decades, I want to go back 170 odd years. Canada has a history of being very instrumentalist when it needs labor supply. If we needed to build a railway, we look to a certain country. If we needed to operate coal mines or steel mills, we looked to certain countries. If you go back 160 odd years, you can see there's a pattern that we have engaged in. At the present time, we are using a piece of legislation, the Immigration Act, and we're using that as some form of proxy for global talent acquisition. And that's the wrong tool. So we need a legislative change. We need a conversation to point that can speak to and articulate why that is important. We need to be able to speak to the ways in which there are certainly labor market challenges, absolutely. But we also need to look ahead. And I urge us to listen carefully to what Foreign Minister Anita Anand said a few days ago about Canada avoiding the inward turning inwards. We need to make sure that you referred to it as soft power earlier. Yes, but it's more than that. It's about leadership on diversity and cultures and language and policy-making opportunities and vision for the future for this country. So while I may have been speaking about regional economies, I want us to not lose sight of how labor force demographics need to be articulated up in ways that will appeal and give policymakers and politicians the opportunity to speak to the long game and the long vision. I met with the Deputy Minister Friday afternoon, and they said to me, I can't ask this question about immigration because there is so much resistance on the doorstep. And so that is a sad state for us. We need to make sure that we are writing those op-eds, getting the people in the room, building the policy, and articulating at a national level why this is important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robert. Rupa.
I guess I will add a hint of optimism to that comment. I think it's a really important comment that Robert made. But at the same time, I think if we look at the small attempted protest that took place in Toronto a couple of weeks ago of folks protesting immigration in the Canadian context, they were outranked in number by the pro-immigration side 10-1 apparently. And to me, that just really does show that Canada continues to be a little bit of a beacon of light. And although of course our sentiments have also changed, we know that, and Canadians are influenced by what's happening in the US, but also in Europe in terms of attitudes towards immigration. But I think that we still fundamentally, most Canadians believe that immigration is needed in Canada. It's good for our economy and it's important. And so there were a lot of concerns related to this rapid growth of immigration after the pandemic. But I don't think that we're at a point of, no return, you could say, or a point where the discourse has gotten so toxic that we almost can't reverse it. If you look at the Environics polls that do show the worrying trends, we still see that most Canadians say that immigrants are good for our economy. So they're worried about the impact of rapid immigration. And so Ali had that meme which showed, rapid change is not a good thing. Sometimes change is a bad thing. And I think that it's that rapid yo-yo movement of too much and then clamping right down and then too much again that is damaging not only to our reputation as a destination country internationally, but to Canadians' understanding of what is going on, what really do we need, and is this good for us or not? So I just want to mention that.
Thank you. Yes. Are there grown-ups running this strategy for Canada? Is really the question. Larissa.
Thanks, Christine. Just building on what Rob and Rupa have shared. I mean, I think if we really want to engage in our communities and, from a national perspective on this, I think we have to really bring it back to just very basic human questions. I mean, we have powerful alumni that have graduated from our institutions that are doing tremendous things in our communities, that are doing tremendous things in the global market space. And I don't think we do enough to amplify those stories, the human stories, right? Where communities are being served, where new businesses are being created that not only, creates wealth for those entrepreneurs, but also opens up opportunities for others, where, groundbreaking research is being, brought that will benefit many. One only has to look at something like the COVID vaccine as an example to see the richness that comes from international talent contributing in broad ways. And I don't think we do enough. I think we need to shout from the rooftops in every community and tell those stories and celebrate those. And I know that's the conversation we've been having with provincial, decision makers, with institutions. I think we have an opportunity here to really share those, because these are individuals who come with their own hopes and dreams, and want to pursue kind of their own paths, but they're also contributing here and abroad. And I think we need to help, really raise that awareness across sectors in different ways, from the early childhood educators who are helping Canadian mothers go back to the workforce because they know that their children are being cared and nurtured, to, scientists in our labs, engaged in some really groundbreaking research, to, lots of small and medium business entrepreneurs that are creating all kinds of wealth in our communities and have the potential to create more. And we haven't done enough. And, we need to move away from scapegoating international students and blaming them for all of these challenges. As Ali talked about, it's complicated, and there are many different headwinds we've been, navigating. But I think if we really bring it down to a human level of impact, the reality is domestic, international, we all have the same basic hopes.
Yeah.
We want to have a future. We want to have a sense of purpose. We want to know that there will be prosperity and safety nets. And we all want to contribute to that and to be part of community and feel as though we belong. And I think we need to tap into those narratives to really advance that.
Absolutely. And maybe we can talk a bit about the work that you're doing with the Global Campaign Initiative, Larissa. Perhaps we'll leave that to the next. But Craig, did you want to weigh in on this? Did we? Or
Yeah, I would just add that I have a really hard time in all of these conversations. I have a hard time losing track of the idea that as of the end of this decade, Canada is going to rely entirely on immigration for population growth. We saw on Ali's slides, like the short-term impact in terms of population growth in the country is obvious, and like every chartered bank in the country is putting forward similar stats right now and sort of ringing the bell saying this is a problem, right? But what that tells me is that sooner or later we're all going to have to come to grips with this in a more coherent sort of policy sense. In the not too distant future, many of us on this call are going to be asked to play a more active role in rebuilding the Canadian education brand and attracting the international talent that Canada will increasingly rely on for its social and economic development. And to me, that is the key point, is that I referred earlier towards a rising tide of public concern about immigration, but I mean, I think we need to have the other side of that story. There needs to be a counter narrative that makes it very clear how instrumental immigration and the attraction of global talent is to the country's future. I think that very critical part of the story has been lost somewhere along the way. And when I think about the incoherence in policymaking in Canada these days, that's mostly what I'm thinking about. We've been using amongst ourselves and even on the call today the term overcorrection. I think that's a very polite way to describe what's been happening in Canada. We have not seen good policymaking, and we really need to take a step back from that and understand just how instrumental the attraction of global talent is to the future of the country.
Absolutely. And I'm reminding of the webinar we did January 2024, about 5 days after the policy announcements with Craig. You were on we had record numbers show up on this webinar. We pulled it together in about a week. And this is what we've talked about. I mean, this is what we predicted. And so here we are.
I personally find it incredibly frustrating because it's it's what speaking of London, it's what our English friends would call an own goal, right? Where you've done yourself harm for no reason. And it's much harder to rebuild and reinforce Canada's international market position, on the back of the kind of experience that we've had this last year or so. And it just feels completely unnecessary. Not to say that we did not need to not to say that we shouldn't have all been concerned about whether those rising levels of immigration were sustainable, but just that there's a completely different way to approach it than we have done.
Absolutely. And it seems like right now it's like a PSA. We need a public service clarification to the Canadian people about this topic.
Yeah.
And it's like an education campaign to talk about the complexities of this, but in plain terms that people can understand and digest and talk about. Okay, so there's one question I'm looking at. I think are we set to go till 2:30? Is that correct? Yes, we are. Okay. So there's one, and I'm going to go to the final question where we're each gonna, I'm going to ask for recommendable actions from the panel. But there's a question here that's connected from David Roberts. It says, how long will the correction take? And this is open to any or many of the panelists. And what are some of the impacts to expect during the correction? We've talked a lot about that. But so how long will this correction take, given that by 2030, we're going to be relying solely on immigration for growth? Given students study 1 to 4 years, have a 1 to 3 year postgrad work permit, and given many are looking for PR, and then also given the current numbers in the country, Larissa, you share this data all the time. Larissa, I'm going to pass it directly to you to kick us off.
Thanks, Christine. Look, I mean, we have to assume certain variables. If we assume a period of policy stability, which is, what we're hoping for, based on the experiences of other markets, we know that it's going to be a 5 to 7 year period of recovery to really get to a place of stabilization. If you take into account, recruitment, enrollment, graduation cycles, and kind of pathways into the labor market. That's what, the experience of our kind of key competitor markets tell us, when they've experienced those kinds of policy U-turns. So I think, we're looking at something well beyond the next 2 academic cycles. I think, but we're hoping for a period of stability where we can begin to lean into these narratives and having a more strategic clarity around where we're going in terms of a talent strategy for this country, what that looks like at a regional, at a community level, the role that our institutions play. There are questions of sustainability in terms of funding for post-secondary education, and we need provinces and territories to step up in these discussions to offer some stability as well. But I think those are some key pieces that need to be considered as we look ahead. And institutions that need to be recalibrating for a new normal. I mean, when Ali shared those numbers of 40 to 60,000 students a year, my head went back to, it was 2008 when we introduced the postgraduate work permit. The year prior to that, we had 65,000 international students in Canada. Just to give context, right? That's 20 years ago. So, I don't know where we'll land, but there's certainly going to be a period of fundamental kind of recalibration. And I think it requires a lot of agility on the part of our institutional leadership and those supporting our institutions in terms of thinking about that talent pipeline.
Absolutely. Ali, please join us if you can put your camera on and join us. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is a great discussion. I just want to throw one idea out there that, I've been in the forecasting business my whole career, and things change, as we've seen it change rapidly. And right now, Canada's facing another front on the trade war. And we have a negotiation coming up with the United States next year on our major trade deal. And, Canada's actually been spared with some of the least worst tariffs relative to other countries. And I kind of see a path where, as the Republicans in the United States recognize the political fallout from some of their actions and, they might have a different approach to Canada and some of their trade partners. And by the end of 2026, the light might be turned on again on the Canadian economy. Some of the big major projects that the new administration is really, really focused might show some progress. Capital may begin to flow, and again, interest rates are lower, housing investment might improve. You could see an economic environment, which is, I'm not going to say shining bright, but significantly better than what we may think of today, given the huge uncertainty. Now, that might matter a lot for universities and colleges and immigration policymakers, because they might realize that, we actually need a slightly higher level of people coming into this country to sustain that growth or build on that growth. But they're taking a more prudent point of view, and I think that's sensible too, to say, look, let's ensure those wins first and then recalibrate. So I agree it's going to take time, but we need to ensure that growth is there. But I talk to people in businesses, bond investors, the whole gamut, you guys, right? And I would say, this is one of the more pessimistic conversations I've been in. But firms are actually a bit more optimistic. They're worried in the short run, certainly they are, and they're not hiring for those reasons. But they like that there's a serious thought about where we're going, even if we're putting pause on many of the strategy we put in. And yes, I completely agree that damages our credibility. But if some of these things do transpire, I think it's going to generate a view that we need more labor demand and we need the highest skilled labor. And maybe we should be aggressively trying to court and poach talent from other jurisdictions. It's not there yet, right? Because they're focusing on those other priorities, and I think that's sensible. But if they get those right, that's when you guys need to be loud and say, we're part of the strategy. It cannot just be building mines and roads and these sorts of things, right? But that's insufficient, clearly, right? But once growth turns on, you need the best people. And I would not be surprised to see another recalibration. Should the GDP numbers improve? Should we see good news with the United States? I know there's a lot of shoulds and ifs here, right? But the politics are actually kind of slowly turning that way.
That is hopeful, Ali. That's what brings hope and an interesting perspective. Did anyone want to comment on that before we go to this? Yeah, Robert.
Might I just pick up on that? And I think Ali has raised a really interesting point here, that if we are to find a space of optimism going forward, and I hope indeed you're right, but I do want to be clear that I don't think we should stumble into that. If things turn around in the next 12, 18, 24 months, that is too late if we do not have something deliberate and intentional about what we need for this country as a strategy. And I'm saying that not simply because I think that's what we need to do, or because it's a critique of public policy making in this country, which has been part of my last 40 years in the country. We stumble through stuff. We don't do enough intentionally, and our global competitors are right on it. Look how quickly the Chinese responded to the US visa situation. My home, original country of New Zealand, decided they'd simply look at what Canada was doing and wasn't doing, and decided they'd simply double the number of international students they want to bring in next year. Now, they're only going to go from 47,000 to 93, something like that. But to Larissa's point a few minutes ago, that's where we were 20 years ago. We need not to stumble on this going forward. We need intentionality, we need thoughtfulness, and we simply cannot afford, to quote a former minister, any form of brain surgery with a chainsaw.
Yikes, absolutely not. Thank you, Robert. Rupa.
I think the other piece that maybe is not the focus of this conversation, but is incredibly important, is that this story is not just about selection and bringing in numbers. It's about what happens to people once they're here. And that has still not been adequately addressed. Our foreign credential recognition story is still incredibly flawed. Even for people who study and graduate from here, outcomes are not where they should be. So when we talk about public education and how do we actually change the discourse, a lot of this has to do with educating employers, educating those who are actually integrating newcomers. It's also about the settlement sector and how it's fallen behind in terms of how it's preparing new arrivals for integrating into society. So, let's not focus entirely on how many, what class, what education level, because what we find is our immigration system, selection system has been well calibrated and recalibrated and calibrated again, and bringing in higher and higher skilled people. But that does not necessarily result in better outcomes unless we have this two-way street where people who are in Canada, employers in particular, actually, also participate in this in this process. The other thing I wanted to add from before, and I put up my hand, is that I think when we do talk about we need to focus on quality rather than quantity. Yes, I agree, but I think that there's way too much focus on that means we only need master's graduates. You know, what a lot of the data is showing is that there are too many university educated people. Perhaps there are fields within that do have shortages. We know there are, but there's lots of intermediate skilled jobs that need to be filled. Now, I'm not arguing that that means we need category-based selection, that we just bring in people for this job or that job. But what I'm suggesting is that the college sector should not be thrown out as being, oh, well, that means we only need university and higher education levels. High quality, intermediate skilled, technical, skilled trades, etc., healthcare, all of that is incredibly important. So we need high skill, high quality, whatever you want to call them, intermediate level skill or technical skilled people just as much, if not more, than the university undergraduate level of people to be brought.
Absolutely. This has been a conversation, a problem for years. This is also making me think, while we go into the last question with 5 minutes left, that it would be interesting to do a panel like this. Ali, it's been great to have you from your economist perspective, which is new to our usual conversations, but to have an employer or someone from multiple sectors and industries as a part of this discussion, which leads me to the closing question that I will ask all of you. And you've basically got about 1 minute each. Ali, I'm going to ask you this too. What would be one action item that you recommend to institutions, businesses, and governments do to resolve this issue? So what's the actions we're doing as a sector, so we're not just talking? And Craig Riggs, I'm going to start with you.
Well, thanks for starting with me. I'm going to pick up on something Rob said a little while ago, which is the one action that I think is important here is to move quickly. And to focus on quality. I'm going to add focus on quality because I'm someone who thinks about international student recruitment a lot and about the quality of the student experience. I think that, we have, all the reason in the world in Canada to sharpen our focus on the quality of education, the quality of student experience, and the quality of student outcomes that we're providing to international students when they come here. The pursuit of better career opportunities is now one of the primary drivers of international student mobility. We have to support that ambition of the students that we're serving in the programs and services we provide to students. And there is a way to do that in a way that serves the interests of the country as well. And I think that's, when we speak about a coherent policy approach, that's partly what I think we're talking about. So move quickly. There's no time to lose here. The competition for talent globally is only intensifying. And the changes what we would make tomorrow would take years to be felt. So it's the sooner we begin, the better.
Couldn't agree more. Ali, you have a flight to catch. I'm going to pass that to you next.
Thanks. I think that this isn't a time to think about how we finance education, post-secondary education. International students, they pay higher tuition, they contribute more per person. And we are going to be in a different regime. I can see, some upside to what I presented, if the economy goes well. But I would be shocked if we get into population growth north of 1.5% for a long, long time. So we need to think about how we finance that. The balance between domestic and foreign students. This is the time to do that. This is ultimately a big part of the crux here. Why this, a lot of the pain is being felt. Let's think about it now. I kind of disagree. I don't think we should rush into advocacy here. We should see what the government wants to do, provide advice, and don't make any moves until you have a sense of where they're going to go. Because, credit to this administration, they're kind of very methodical in how they think about it, and they haven't decided some of their broader strategies yet. So I would be more patient, not to say that I disagree with what you're advocating, but I would be more patient on that. And let's think about how we make this sustainable on the finance side.
Thank you, Ali. Rupa.
I echo a lot of what both Craig and Ali have said, but I think personally, I would like to see the topic of immigration less prominently featured in newspaper editorials, to be honest. Why? Because my perception is that this has driven a lot of the negative sentiment in the Canadian population. It's a population trap. It's, there's too many international students. The housing market is connected with this, on and on and on. So in order to have a more measured approach, I think we should focus on making Canada's economy more vibrant, focusing on the actual economic prosperity, productivity aspect of it, rather than honing in so much all the time from the media side on international students and immigrants. And so if we want to put together an op-ed, it should be much more about how do we ensure that Canada's economy is strong, and one piece of that is immigration, rather than focusing so squarely so much on immigration.
Thank you, Rupa. Okay, Larissa and Robert, we have about 30 seconds each before Miriam's going to close. Robert, I'll go to you, and then Larissa, I'll ask you to close.
I'll be very quick, and then I'll pass it to Larissa. I think that, first of all, I disagree with Ali in terms of waiting. I don't think we are hearing from this government as to what they think they want. And I'm fearful that if we wait 12 months, then we will hear something that is actually not fitting either with our federal government or our provincial governments. I think what we need to do is create a coherent policy statement on a national strategy for talent, global talent acquisition. I agree with Rupa that it shouldn't be focused on immigration. It should be focused on talent and the future for our economy and our civil society. We need that statement. It's some of the work that Larissa's team is doing on the Global Canada Global Initiative. And there's my segue to Larissa.
Thanks, Rob. 3 quick points. One, I think we need all levels of education engaged in terms of that international talent, and that extends to the K-12 level. We want to actually embed families in our communities. There's no better way to start than international students who are being accompanied by loved ones at that earlier learning level. 2, I'm optimistic about the future. I know Ali heard some pessimism, but I'm actually very optimistic. I think the fact remains, and we have to find a way to convey our future prosperity in this country is an equation where we need talent, both domestic and international. That is the reality. And so we need to find, as Rob and Rupa and Craig and others have spoken, we need to find a way to do this strategically, to have a framework that allows us to position it to meet the needs at all of those levels, regional, community, etc. And part of that means inserting ourselves and making sure we're at the table now in the conversations that matter, so that the strategic capacity of our education institutions as motors for our future prosperity are well understood, and that we're leveraging every possible opportunity to squeeze that strategic value out of the work of our institutions, and not just inbound student mobility, all dimensions of international education. I think that's fundamentally where we need to go, and we have a lot of work to do to come together as stakeholders to feed this narrative and to nurture that role for our institutions.
Thank you, Larissa. And thank you to everyone for taking the time. Now I'm going to pass this back to Miriam for the closing. I think we deserve a place on the National tonight. Over to you, Miriam.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We appreciate all of our esteemed panelists for all of their feedback and their insights into the changing landscape, and Ali for his walkthrough. There will be a recording available for this session coming forward as well. So thanks again on behalf of CIBC, IDP, and CBIE for joining us today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.